Greetings and welcome to this session of chats about inclusive education. In these sessions, we introduce you to individuals across Canada who are doing and have done interesting and important things to promote inclusive education in Canadian schools. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Diane Richler, who's a former Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada, formerly called the Canadian Association for Community Living. Diane's now active on a global level with Inclusion International and their Catalyst on Inclusive Education initiative. Also with us today is Jackie Specht, who's a professor at Western University in London, Ontario. And Jackie is the chair of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education and coordinates in some projects up to a couple of dozen researchers and academics across Canada on inclusive education projects of various kinds. So today our guest and welcome is Donna Barrett from Alberta. Donna's a parent. She's been an activist for inclusive education along with her husband for many years. She's been a teacher, a consultant, a principal, assistant superintendent, superintendent of schools. She's worked at all levels in the system and very senior levels, including being the CEO of a school division in Alberta. And she did her doctorate at the University of Alberta and is one of the more knowledgeable people about inclusive education in the country. Right now, she does advocacy work for Inclusion Alberta with parents and families working to get schools to include their child. So it's great to have you with us, Donna. Welcome. And tell us what you're up to these days in terms of working with families.
I'm working with just a couple of families right now in some very successful inclusive environments. Of course, everything has been changed by the pandemic, but we have some really good individual examples of inclusion.
So how do you get linked up with the families, and what kind of things do you need to do to support them?
Well, usually the family connections come through Inclusion Alberta. So the parent is the starting point. And then usually I'm the connecting person to the school. So most of my role is supporting schools with inclusion and working with parents sort of in the background.
So it's a cooperative effort on your part to help the school figure out how to include the child?
Yes. And schools are in really different places. Right now, I'm working with a school division, one of the larger school divisions in Edmonton, and they have a really good team that's doing the work. And so my role is not so much with the teacher, but it's with the supporting the specialist team and looking at networking with them rather than directly with a classroom teacher.
So how would you assess inclusion or the opportunity for kids to be included in Alberta as a whole right now? Just in a few sentences, how would you characterize it?
I think you could get it if you are willing to advocate for it. So it's a choice that's available, but it's generally not the first choice that's offered.
The system doesn't offer inclusion as the first choice.
Well, I think, I'm not sure I'd put it that way, but there in the larger system, there is a significant infrastructure of special education. And so a parent, that's offered as a choice. And then, but a parent needs to say, well, that's not the choice I want. This is the choice I want.
And how is Inclusion Alberta, although I realize you're not necessarily speaking for everything they do, but how does Inclusion Alberta contribute to that conversation?
Well, I think Inclusion Alberta really helps parents understand that inclusive education is a valid choice. Many parents start wanting that, but it's supporting parents to learn how to work with the system to access that for their children.
Well,
Go ahead, Jackie.
Sorry. No, I was just wondering, Donna, you made an interesting comment that if parents are willing to advocate for inclusion, they can get it. So why is it that they have to advocate rather than that being the choice that's open?
Well, I think it depends on the system, the school system too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in some of the urban systems, there's a great deal of energy over the years has gone into creating special education programs, and so there's a great belief within the school system that that's where children get the best service. So I still think schools believe they're inclusive, but by inclusive, they mean you're included in the school, not necessarily in the classroom with other kids, the regular classroom, for want of a better word. In other school systems, for example, when I worked in Northland, the inclusion was the de facto option because people weren't going to have their children leave the community to go to another school, and most of the schools were so small enough that they hadn't conceptualized of having special education classes. And it was also culturally, because the school division served First Nation and Métis students, the idea of going somewhere else, was just not something that was acceptable, or even being coded was not something that was acceptable.
It's interesting because we've had those conversations with other people in other provinces, and the very same thing comes up. The large urban centers have invested a lot of time and energy into special education, and so
money.
It's harder to change that ship, as it were.
Yeah.
But what was it like for a strong advocate for inclusion to be in senior positions in systems that necessarily weren't supportive? That's question A. And question B is wondering about how you coped with your two identities as a senior school administrator and a parent.
Well, by the time I was a senior school administrator, my children had pretty well worked their way through the system. So, but it was a challenge when I was a school principal. I was selective about, I knew what I wanted, but I also knew that the principals and the district I was in was a very strong proponent of parents choosing which schools their children went to. And I made, Bruce and I made diligent use of that choice. And we chose to go to schools where our wants and desires for our son would be accepted and supported.
And what about being in systems that weren't necessarily moving strongly in that direction?
Well, I still, there is a direction that the system has, and you do as a leader, even if you're the superintendent, you have to work in that system. So I think that's a reality. And you look for your opportunities to advocate for different positions in that role. When parents, for example, were requesting an inclusive program, we were able to support that and able to help, the system understand, or the school where the child wanted to go, that this was something that the district supported. We were a district of choice, and as a principal, we want you to be supporting this. So it's advocating, but it's advocating within the umbrellas and choices that the system offers.
And how, which strategies that parents used do you think were the most successful in achieving what they wanted for their sons and daughters?
Well, I think parents have to be clear about what they want. And from that point on, they have to work with the system. So sometimes I think parents are clear about what they want, and they also can make it more difficult for themselves by insisting that they want it done in a certain way. So a lot of the work we do with parents is to be clear on what you want, but not prescriptive on what you want it. For example, with support. And I think parents have come a long way with that kind of thing.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So instead of and this is the coaching that we do with parents, right? You want your child in a grade 4 class, supported class. The classroom curriculum is the curriculum that you're looking for, not some other curriculum. And the supports need to be there for your child, but you're not saying there has to be an EA there, right? Those kinds of things. That's the school's job to figure out, not the parents.
And parents accept that?
Well, I think they do. We caution them against being really, the two things we caution parents about is one around what supports look like. And the other one is around saying that I want my child to learn, X, Y, and Z, because that's the way what they think is next. What the appropriate curriculum for children is the curriculum that's already been approved by the province. And those are the valid learning experiences. This is a big shift for teachers too, because there's still such a belief that there's in this kind of developmental model, rather than, the classroom curriculum is the core curriculum. That's where the learning happens. And therapists also will have to understand that too, that it's, we really try and help parents understand, the school is not the place for therapy. Therapy happens somewhere else. And we discourage things like pullouts and those kinds of things. But there is real work to be done with the specialist teams that are necessary in some cases for kids who have really complex needs, to have an inclusive lens as well in terms of how things can look in the classroom.
One of the elements that talked about a lot is leadership, particularly leadership at the school level. What do you think is needed to move more leaders to have an appreciation for how inclusive practice can improve not only the learning of students with special needs, but the learning of all children? And do you have any examples of where you saw that happen, where a school principal actually, like the light went on, they said, yeah, I can see that supporting inclusion actually helps make my school a better school?
I think you can talk to people about it. I think they can see the connections between the kind of work we're doing in universal design, that sort of thing helps them think about it. But really, I think having a quality experience helps principals, and really, I think there needs to be lots of support for leaders to see how it can happen. But also, there's this tendency that we see programming not as part of a bigger school thing, but it's really focused on an individual child. And I think we have to be really intentional about making the points that you made about the quality of education improving when we talk with principals too, or having that commentary with them, because I've had a couple of experiences where the principal will see it as a great thing and is really pleased with what's happened in the school, but they don't extrapolate to the bigger impact. It's still a child by child sort of perspective.
Right, that's been my experience. Getting people to think systemically about the whole school, and the fact that every time they send a child out of the class, there's money that goes with the child that goes into that special program or that teacher or that EA or that therapist. Like the connection between understanding that sending children out means you're sending resources out doesn't seem to click with a lot of people in leadership positions.
I think that is because historically we have attached dollars to kids. And a number of years ago, Alberta, I think, did something that, and I don't know what the situation is like in other provinces, but Alberta did something that I don't think we've really seen the full impact, and that is they took away individualized funding. Unfortunately, at the provincial level, so it's all blocks, and it's not necessarily around codes. Unfortunately, the school divisions are still using, even though they don't get the money that way, they allocate it out that way rather than in blocks of money. So I don't think that's a complete answer, but I think we have to stop looking at resourcing. It's this whole focus on individual students. And I had a very interesting conversation with a vice principal last week she's really committed to inclusion. They have, in a small city in Alberta, that her teachers work really well with children who have significant learning needs who are in their classrooms. They meet with their learning support teachers. They co-plan units based on the curriculum. They do all of these kinds of things, and it's working really smoothly. Her challenge is having her teachers understand that it's adapting and modifying programming for the kids who have needs, but they're not as significant as these particular individual students. And my guess is that these students come with an EA. And so they do the programming, somebody else is delivering them. It's all this big question of, as a classroom teacher, am I really responsible for programming for everybody who's in the room? And I don't think we've got that idea through to people yet.
Speaking of EAs, the places that I'm familiar with, and I'll speak particularly New Brunswick, there's just a continuing ratchet up of the number of EAs the system says it needs, even with declining enrollments and with teacher reductions. The system seems to think that every problem, an individual problem of a student in a school, the cheapest, least expensive, most ready way to get that off the table, so it's not a headache for somebody, is to put an EA in place. Have you had that experience in Alberta? Is there control on EAs, or is it just sort of a thirst for them that's hard to quench.
Well, I'll say yes, but I'm gonna just take another tact on this. Michael Fullen said years ago that every classroom should have an EA. And rather than having paraprofessionals being linked somehow to, again, to individual students with identified needs, there are lots of things that happen in a classroom you don't need to be a certificated teacher to do. And if our practice was more that we either use team teaching models or some combination of professional teachers and paraprofessionals as a practice, so that there would be the scope in more classrooms to meet the needs of all kids, the way the room is staffed, then that might be another approach to dealing with this. You know, the solution to every problem is another EA. So I know that too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If it's, every teacher could use another set of hands as long as it's not tied to that student right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just sort of, building on that. I think that's where I personally have seen inclusion work real well in schools where the EA is in the classroom, but not for those 3 students or that one student, just there as another teacher. And in the eyes of the children, that's what that person is, as another teacher, not tied to that student. And certainly all the research on educational assistance would help us understand that, right? That we don't want someone tied to a child, because that doesn't allow that socialization to happen either. So, that's certainly really interesting. I wonder, how do we get that model?
Well, I think we should call them, they're either the teacher's assistant or the educator's assistant, and start looking at, what a model like that would do, and how you would fund it, and what role that person would have. And I would look at a blended role of how can we release teachers from some of the things that they are required to do that are not, that you don't need. I mean, if you're trying to build support for teachers, things that they have to do that don't require an educator to do, and let teachers work on the things that you need a degree to do. Planning, building the capacity of others, those kinds of things. The professional development opportunities across classrooms, those kinds of things. I'd really work on that side of it. And would you need, I don't know in sum total if you would need more EAs, but they would be very differently distributed than I think they are now.
Just coming back to the leadership issue, you were at senior levels in one very large and one not so large school districts. To what degree was a candidate's knowledge or experience with inclusion part of the selection criteria to be named a principal or a vice principal? And if there was, is it built into the system, or was it coincidental to the particular circumstances?
Well, if you look at Alberta now, it is built into the TQS document. It's built into the LQS document.
You'll have to tell us in non-Alberta language what that is.
Okay, the teaching quality standard is the requirement for teachers. And the teaching quality standard has very clear competency around inclusive practices. Now, what people mean by inclusive practices is still kind of open to debate, but you have a starting point. And school leaders, it's not a separate section, which is something I was disappointed to see, but there is a requirement for principals to facilitate inclusion. The issue that we have is, what do we mean by inclusion? Right. And so, but there's a starting point there to work with people. And I think how important it is in terms of leadership selection depends on the system and what they're trying to do. And in some systems, finding leadership staff is way easier in urban environments than it is in remote and rural environments. It is a real challenge so the focus there, I think, is building capacity.
Diane?
Yeah, a very different question, but relating back to something that you said before. One of the things that families and organizations of persons with disabilities focus on a lot is the need for individualizing a plan and supports for students, and the whole concept of individual education plans and how those get developed. How do you make sure that there's both a focus on the supports needed for the individual child, but yet you're not developing a separate educational program for that child, but rather making sure that what you're talking about is making the curriculum accessible to every child?
Well, this is something we've grappled with because IEPs, individual support plans, whatever they're called, are legal requirements right now. So teachers have to do them. We've tried to help teachers to do that by looking at putting something in the plan that talks about the starting point being the whatever it is, grade 5 curriculum, adapted and modified. And then we also have really encouraged a goal about participation with peers. So when we look at goals, it's access to the curriculum with some learning goals that are related to the curriculum. Peer interaction with peers is usually another goal that we look at, and the emphasis is really on strategies to improve access, not so much on the goals. And it is important, I think, to have some strategies written down that teachers are going to use, that sort of you can build on. And a lot of the times the reflection is, did these strategies work? And how did they work? Which ones need to be continued? I've also worked on really a couple of really powerful transition documents where we, with children that have really complex needs, looking at some of those strategies and showing models of how they're actually embedded in the classroom work. So the next teacher doesn't have to start all over again from scratch.
Okay, well, our time for this chat is up. Donna, do you have a final word? Let's, for example, something you're optimistic about moving forward.
Something I'm optimistic about. Well, I've seen some, in individual cases, I've seen some amazing things happen with some fabulous teachers. It's just, it would be wonderful if we could make that as infectious as some other things that we experience.
So let's make it infectious. That's a good way to end.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being with us, and that ends this session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.